Hello and welcome to this Harmoniously podcast. Here is Melissa,
Hi, I'm Nick Egan.
and we have Nick with us. I'm so excited to have Nick with us today. So he's one of the founder of Harmoniously, and he's also has such an interesting story and so on that we would dig in today. But before starting, let's do as usual our arriving practice or tune in. So let's just take really a couple of seconds, a moment to tune in into this podcast, to be arriving here. If you're listening as well, you can close your eyes, take a comfortable position, and just take a couple of moments to connect with your breath, to connect with the present moment. Just allow yourself to be arriving here and now. Just to be fully present, arriving to your full presence. And then slowly you can come back into the podcast. Open your eyes. All right. So we love to do that. I think, unique as well. You love to, I'm sure, meditate or also doing longer, like tuning in or arriving practice, whatever we want to call this. But it's nice also if we can just take a couple of seconds. Anyway, so I was checking your story and it's so interesting. So tell us more about you.
Well, now I work as a coach, mostly with entrepreneurs and some executives at bigger companies, usually tech companies often. And when I'm working with coaches, I usually coach them in how to set up a practice. But I started off, my undergrad was in psychology, and I thought I would be a therapist. And I ended up becoming a bit disillusioned, I think, with how I was being taught therapy and that modality. And so I decided to switch gears and study really philosophy and religion, but especially Asian philosophy and religion, specifically Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. And I had been practicing at that time. So I started practicing meditation, especially Zen, when I was much younger, like 16. And from there, I kind of I transitioned to the Tibetan practices because it spoke to me a bit more. So with my academic career, I then went on to get a master's PhD in Asian philosophy, particularly Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and ended up studying in a monastery in Nepal for quite some time, leading tours throughout the Himalayan region for some time. And then I came back to the United States and looked around and started working. And from there, I actually had a interesting interaction with a coach. And this coach really completely impressed me. She was an ad executive from Chicago, and she was in the training program. And so from that point, I was like, oh, here's a modality that really speaks to me, that I had been looking for, I think, when I was going through training to think about becoming a therapist. And so then from there, I just jumped into it. And that was quite a few years now. So I've been doing this for a bit of time.
Okay, so tell me more about what was about psychology that did not really resonate with you.
So it was not necessarily psychology in particular. It was therapy, especially the kind of therapy that I was exposed to. I really enjoyed like Gestalt therapy, somatic therapy, so based in the body. But what I was finding was that, at least from my limited perspective at that time, people would often get stuck. From my perspective, this is all very subjective, right? I know there's a lot of people that have different experiences. They would get stuck in understanding the why of what they were experiencing, but not really understanding how to change that. And in my world, in my way of thinking, it's not enough to sort of know why you are sick, for instance. You also have to have a path to get better. And so I felt like that was lacking, at least in my training. I know that there are many modalities, especially these days. Psychology is only 120 years old, give or take, and it's developing, right? So it's developing just like all things in the West. And so I was much more drawn to Buddhist, in particular, descriptions of the mind, descriptions of what we would consider like psychology. So Buddhist psychology, things like Abhidharma, that sort of mentality. It was much more oriented toward a feeling of wholeness and completeness. Like there's a state of being healed, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not just like, well, I'm no longer sick. It's actually like flourishing and thriving.
Mm-hmm. And that's so interesting. And I had a similar, like, I wouldn't really say path, but like when I selected my branch of study, I was always hesitant between psychology and languages.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up choosing languages at first because I really had no doubt about that. It really was a passion. But about psychology, I had like I did study some book myself. And then there was something that was not resonating with me, and it's what you just described now. And of course, at the same time, as you said, nowadays there's many, like there's positive psychology, behavioral psychology, so it has developed a lot as well. But definitely then when I found coaching, that was like the missing piece, at least that the missing piece that resonated with me and that made me fall in love with coaching as well, and not with psychology. So also each person,
Yeah,
right, has their own path
exactly.
this way.
Well, and coaching in particular arose out of psychology, out of therapy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it wasn't
Yes.
like in 1997 when Seligman gave this big discussion at the American Psychological Association, and he talked about like we have to move toward a positive psychology. That was the birth of
Mm-hmm.
the positive psychological movement, and coaching itself is an offshoot of that. So I always think of it as like two sides of the same coin with maybe a different focus. And you have to think too, at that time, this
Mm-hmm.
was like the late 90s, early 2000s. It was not as simple to research as it is now, right? Like now I had to, of course, we had
Mm-hmm.
the internet and all of that, but it wasn't like I could just go online and find a list of different modalities and then find somebody to explore them. You're very limited in terms of your geographic location. And I happen to be in the Bay
Mm-hmm.
Area, so I had exposure to a lot of things, but it wasn't like I could go really find somebody with a particular modality that I want. So things have
Mm-hmm.
changed a lot, I think, for the better in that way, for sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it's true that coaching is, as psychology, all this field is pretty new, as you said, with starting with psychoanalysis and psychology and all that, and then now developing into coaching. So we are developing different professions within mental wellness, if you want,
Exactly.
because we are realizing that different people have different needs, and
Yeah.
that's why we are developing this. But anyway, I also want to know more about, like you said, that how Buddhism explained the mind. So, what is the
Yeah. A
Buddhist
simple
point of
topic,
view?
right? that um so the question is like, how does Buddhism think about the mind? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So that's a really good question, for a lot of reasons. Like in Buddhism, there's different ways of thinking about what in the West we trope as the mind, right? So it's all the mind. So in the West, we talk about the mind
Mm-hmm.
as like I'm thinking. But in Buddhism in particular, there's the thinking mind for sure. And then there's also what is a better translation would be like consciousness, or even spirit to some degree is a better translation of
Mm-hmm.
like a deeper level of mind. So Buddhism has two things going on. There's a really clear description of emotions that will arise in the mind, what the precursors to those emotions might be, and then how to work with those emotions. And that's like an ordinary sort of thinking, analytical type of meditation. And I can give an example in a second. And then
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism also talks about mind as like the essential nature of one's experience and one's being. And that's where you get into things like it's all mind. Everything is
Mm-hmm.
mind. It's all a projection. Everything is infinite divine consciousness. That kind of mind
Mm-hmm.
is like the foundation, the structure of that thinking mind. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
A little.
So I'll give you an example.
So
I'll give you
explain
an
more.
example. Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
give us more
It's a deep
example.
concept. Um, so the deepest level of mind would be like, okay, I'm going to sit down and have a moment of clarity. Perhaps there's an absence of thought, and I feel like a divine oneness. So like somebody
Mm-hmm.
that's in maybe a yogic tradition or in Christian traditions, or even has that way of thinking, they might feel like, oh, everything is one, everything is bliss. Everything is consciousness, things are made out of consciousness or energy. That's all kind of that realm. And in Buddhism, we talk about that as everything is mind, right? But then when you're going through day to day and it's like, oh, I have a moment of anger, right? I have a moment of anger. Yes, ultimately that moment of anger is that divine bliss. And if you can recognize it in that moment, then no problem, right? But also if you can't recognize it, if you're like, I'm really pissed off right now, then what can you do to reflect, to shift that anger, right? So for instance, if I have a moment of anger and like I'm not in a blissed out state and I'm like pissed off, then I might say something like, oh, okay, actually the person that's making me angry, they too are in the grip of some kind of negative emotion. So I can like chill out a little bit, right? Or I can think like, well, anger itself is not very helpful. So maybe I can just find a way to let go of that. Or maybe I can just be like, express it in some way that's a bit more healthy. So those are two layers of the mind that are not mutually exclusive. Psychology, as most people are experiencing it, and so therapy or coaching really works with like the psychological aspects of the mind, whereas like the mystical side is also there, and that's the deeper level, kind of like capital M mind. Is that a little bit more clear?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I really wanted to understand better, especially because totally understand, but I may use different words to indicate the same concept. So sometimes it's always more important to be more clear.
Yeah.
And
I just want to say a couple of words about like translation. So I came up in a fairly strict, I guess I'll call it upbringing. I've been practicing Buddhism and meditation for long, like 25 plus years. And early on, there was a lot of, and my teachers, my mentors were really serious about like translation. They were like, don't be sloppy with translation. Use the specific words, be clear about what you're meaning. And I found that really helpful, and it was very good for me. And what I've found in modern times, it's also really helpful if you can be a little bit sloppy and give people like a taste of it, right? Because what happens is, so sometimes I teach meditation, not very often, but when I do, often I'll meet people that have been meditating for 10 years and they just have this like very rigid conception of what meditation is. And really, if you do meditation properly with enough effort over a period of time, it naturally will become more relaxed and blissful and positive, right? And it's not this like real struggle and like, I sit down and do my 10 minutes and force myself and all that stuff. And how people conceptualize the notion of mind, I think, is at the root of this, because they think it's like, I have to force my mind. But if you say things that are a little bit more like in Buddhism, we talk about Buddha nature and that kind of stuff, and more like, allow yourself to relax into the blissful state. It's very different than like focus your mind on your breathing, right? One is a tool to get to the other, but ultimately you're trying to relax into the blissful state. So being like a little bit juicy, maybe sloppy is not the right word, juicy with languaging can be very effective, I find.
No, absolutely. I agree. As I said, like I study languages, so I'm really like, and that's one of my first passions. So I'm really not picky, but like I go deep into the understanding of language and words, and also the use of words. And on top of that, also as a coach, as all my background, it's really the words here you use are very important. They carry meaning, they carry connotation, they carry energy also behind.
Yeah. Oh,
they
see, my
carry
teachers they'd love you.
ancestral memory.
My teachers they're like, yes, that's right. They're past now, but I'll give you like it's interesting now that we're going on this like a bit of a tangent with it. That's a good reason why at least have some familiarity with like the original verbiage, whether it's Sanskrit or Tibetan, or if you're in the Chinese tradition or Japanese tradition, because the semantic range of particular words are so important and they can lead you astray. And I'll give you a really common one. So my tradition mainly these days is Tibetan, like I mentioned. And something that we do a lot of is it gets translated into English as as visualization, right? So visualize. And so people are like sitting here thinking all these things, and that's true. That's what you do in the beginning. But the actual word for visualization is smriti, which means like to recollect or to like remember. So like remember that you are a divine enlightened being. right? And yes,
Mm.
there's imagery that goes along with that, but that has a very different flavor to it, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It does. Such a different flavor. And also, like, okay, if we're going to, I'm sure that the words itself, the sounds that are
Mm.
utters to say that words vibrate at a certain level
Mhm.
when you hear it, especially Sanskrit, for example, in India and in Tibet. I don't know what's the name of the original language. That
Tibetan, yeah, that
Tibetan.
so
Okay, easy.
yeah, yeah, that's an interesting concept. So that concept, so within Buddhism, there's different schools of, and by schools I mean like traditions of practice, right? And they're not necessarily in disagreement with each other, but they have different tools that they emphasize.
Yeah.
So Zen practice, the Zen that I came up in, which is Soto, would very much like breathing, meditation, focusing your mind, posture is a big deal. And then in Tibetan side, they have those practices. They also have like this idea of mantra. And mantra is a Sanskrit term, which means, it's two words actually. So manas means like the mind, and traya, which means protection. So mantra actually means
Mm-hmm.
mind protection. And then the question is like, well, what are you protecting your mind from? You're actually protecting your own mind from thinking that it's limited. So you're protecting your
Mm-hmm.
mind from its own limitations. And so what they say
Mm-hmm.
is that in mantra, so if you say a very classic mantra is like Om Mani Padme Hum, or just Om,
Mm-hmm.
or Om Ma Hung,
Mm-hmm.
in Tibetan they talk about that. Those words carry power in the sense that it's ringing the bell of your own enlightened nature. So it's like a
Mm-hmm.
way to ring the bell of your own enlightened nature and to have you recollect that you're actually are divine. And so that's why these mantras have power. So even in like Tibet, very, very few mantras. There are a few exceptions to this, but almost all mantras are in Sanskrit because they point back to the original, like, hey, the words, the actual spoken energy crystallized into vibration. And it
Mm-hmm.
helps you to recognize these things while you're having while you're saying this mantra. Almost
Mm-hmm.
like at a high level, not a high level, at a more experienced level, the mantra itself creates the experience for you. So in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, you're saying Om Mani Padme Hum, okay, I'm going to be compassionate, I'm doing all these visualizations. But then as you get a little more used to it, it's like, oh, Om Mani Padme Hum is like bringing forth, evoking that sense of like calm, compassion, peace, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, at first you probably translate it in your mind. And anyway, when it's your native language, but not only your native language, if you're really fluent to a language and you hear different words evokes inside of you,
Mm-hmm.
different emotions, connotation, images already just hearing them.
Yeah.
So I'm sure with that, and on top of that, the mantra have that perfect sound.
Mm-hmm.
We know how the sound itself vibrates within you, as you just explained. So it's a powerful tool
Exactly.
that we have.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, what else about that tradition? Your tradition?
About in Tibetan tradition,
Well, in general,
just in general in Buddhism.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
Buddhism is
that for
interesting.
you. That maybe something that for you, would say, I don't know, but about your story, something that stuck with you, that really is a tool or like a flood or something, aha moment that really, yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know the words now. I'm losing my words. So.
that's okay. Yeah, soundlessness is probably the ultimate. Something that is, well, one of the characteristics when I was getting into spiritual stuff when I was much younger. Again, we're going back to like what's available. Where can you
Mm-hmm.
go? And I was reading these books and like so inspired by everything. And then when you meet a teacher that fully embodies whatever the tradition is that you're trying to experience, it can become like quite a powerful experience. And that was one of the things that drew me in particular to Dharma, to Buddhism, because not every, but many teachers that I met, and the more teachers that I met, the more it was affirmed that like, oh, they have a they have a particular feeling. Like, I don't know what the feeling is, and I can maybe feel like I have the feeling of being around them. And some of that I think has to do with the person, right? It's like, are you
Mm-hmm.
ready to experience that feeling? But I didn't necessarily have that through other kinds of teachers that I was in contact with. It's funny. I don't talk about this very often, but when I was really young, when I was first able to drive, I started studying Zen and I started studying Qigong, which is like, it's Buddhist, both Buddhist and Taoist, and also health. And it's just basically moving energy from the Chinese tradition, very connected to martial arts if you want it to be. But I was also studying more of like a Western meditation tradition that came out of like energy practices, some kind of yogic practice, but it was all seated. And the teacher, we got to become really close, and I became one of his advanced students after, a period of 3 years. And he could do amazing things. Like, the man could display, honestly, like powers. Basically, he could read your mind. Not in a, I don't know, maybe it was some kind of trick, but it certainly fooled the heck out of me. Like, he could read minds, tell the future within reason. He had a lot of this kind of power.
Mm-hmm.
We became fairly close, but as I became closer to him, I realized like he really was not a happy person. He wasn't happy. He wasn't contented. He wasn't fulfilled in any way. He certainly wasn't compassionate in any way. And he wasn't even pretending. He would be the first one to be like, yeah, I'm not even pretending to be those things. But in my mind, I was thinking, well, like, what good is it if you can move energy around or read people's auras or whatebe, and still, like, you're unhappy?
Mm-hmm.
It misses the point entirely of spiritual practice. And if you go
Mm-hmm.
back to like the original traditions, every meditation tradition that I know of that's serious, they always say, like, be careful of, in Sanskrit, it's siddhis, siddhi, like powers. Be careful of getting caught up in powers, because they're very real and they're very accessible, and they don't really ultimately benefit you. You also have to have a taste of the oneness, however
Mm.
that's conceptualized.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. That's also true that when someone approaches spirituality because they have this quest inside them,
Mhm.
and then they may look up at people that are further along the journey, but there's true that there are people that maybe there's some people that maybe they're just sort of pretending, if you want, or
Mhm.
not really there. Maybe but anyways, their journey, and that's fine. But there's also some of cases as you described, and that's important to know and to let people know that may happen as well. Like, it's not because if someone is in a spiritual journey or has some, as I said, power, or also like has been studying, practicing for so long, that is perfect, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
always, yeah.
Be careful. The
And
people that I know that are real authentic tend to be the most humble, and not in a
mhm,
way. There's a weird thing, and that's very common in America. I don't know how common it is in Italy, but it's like there's some kind of people that are like, oh, I'm so humble. You know what I mean? And it's not. It's like I'm bragging about how humble one
mhm.
might be, and you should be very careful of that. Like, if you're all sweetness and light and like, oh, I'm such a humble, like, run away. One of my
Mhm.
teachers used to say that. He would say, sweetness and light, you just run away from it.
Yeah, that's true. So it's it's like, as even though spirituality is, if you want, maybe the ultimate journey someone may take, if you want to say that way, or anyway, if we take the hierarchy of need of Maslow, it's definitely arrives when we fulfill the other needs.
Mhm.
So at least according to that, we can say it's the ultimate journey someone can take. But yeah, it's important to send this message that also there's still full of human doing in that journey, and they're not perfect because they're spiritual. And also, do not think that because there's people that, even though they are in their spiritual journey, are not perfect yet, that doesn't mean that spirituality is not useful. It still is.
That's an
Still go
excellent,
ahead with your question.
excellent
With your
point.
quest.
Yeah, excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has to. That's a really, really good point. People in jail, even if you commit murder or whatever, something bad, like, there still is you still have the essence of whatever you perceive of as spiritual within all, no
Mm-hmm.
matter what. That can't be taken away. It can become harder to access for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't mean you don't try to do it, try to access it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's very important to follow that fire.
Yeah,
That is always
exactly.
there. It's always there. It's like the fire of life.
Hmm.
It's always present.
Yeah, true.
And so then I'm so even more curious. So now you said now you're a coach.
Mhm.
So so you were in the monastery. So you came back because you finished your study, or there was something else that
Yeah,
called you back to the United States?
yeah. So I've studied in the monastery as part of my field work. So I wasn't living there;
Mm-hmm.
I was living outside. And
Okay.
then I was kind of intermittently for a good period of time, maybe 10 years. So I would fly back, I would do tours. So at the time, no kids and nothing like that. So it's easy to go to stay in Asia. And then a group would come, usually connected to like either a publishing company or a museum, something like that, that they wanted somebody to be able to translate culturally for them. It wasn't necessarily a Buddhist tour. It was like a lot around art too, like art and
Mm-hmm.
history and that kind of thing. And so I was leading those tours, and then eventually, like, you just end up coming back. And my family is on the West Coast, so family is an important piece of that. And then kind of figuring out those things, and then it's like, how do you integrate in a way that can also be that where you're also paid, right? Like, I've met people, I know
Mm-hmm.
many Westerners that have done like a 3-year meditation retreat, and
Mm-hmm.
they struggle because they're like, well, what do I do now? Do I go off
Yeah.
and am I a monk now? Like, you're not really a monk. Do you want to go have a family? Like, there's not really a place in our culture for like professional religious people that aren't attached to like a church. Whereas like in Tibet and India, you can become a sadhu, you can become a householder that does practices. In Tibet, there's the
Mm-hmm.
Nakba tradition. So you can have a family, and then you become sort of like a healer on top of like a spiritual person in there. And so in the West, at least in America, we don't really have that. So then it's like, well, what do you do? And that's why I think so many people are called to like coaching, because there's some elements of it that can be creatively worked to help people in that way.
I never thought of coaching that lens, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be. Sometimes, I mean, not everybody, right?
Yeah,
Everybody's
no,
different.
yes.
Yeah. And there are times when there are many coaching clients where they're just talking about like communication skills or
Yeah.
confidence or something like that. It doesn't necessarily always want to go to that. But same thing too with like religious practice. Sometimes people in their
Mm-hmm.
religious, quote unquote, spiritual life, they're just wanting a little bit more peace and harmony, or maybe success, things like that. That's very common too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And coming back to the word like coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we say coach to a vast variety of offering, right? It goes
Sure.
from, I don't know, like for example, I hired for English pronunciation coach or accent reduction coach.
Nice.
For
Perfect.
example, still a coach, or like a cooking coach, or
Yeah.
like can be anything, right? And then
Yeah.
there's also executive coach, business coach, life coach,
Mm-hmm.
and even just like sport coach. Yeah, all the coaches in sports. And so I think there can be a little confusion among
Mm-hmm.
all this variety of offering. And at first, I was trying to look for another word maybe to define the ones that do more of spiritual psychological work.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, I was like, maybe actually coach does work, because it gives the idea that the client needs to put the work.
Yeah.
Exactly, like going to the gym. It's like, I'm your coach, but I don't lift the weight for you. Otherwise, it
Right.
doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's one of my favorite analogies. Yeah, coach. Well, I mean, places like the International Coaching Federation and things like that, they've done a good
Mhm.
job of getting the core capacities of what counts as a coach. I think there are like
Yes.
5 or something. And so it's a good way to standardize at least how we're talking about coaching, as opposed to like consulting. So coaching is
Mhm.
not consulting, it's not therapy.
Mhm.
those are the two big ones that people conflate it with.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, there are different kinds of coach, accent coach and all that. Usually, like, the broadest definition is somebody that will help you get better at the thing that you want to get better at. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so oftentimes when I think of, if I'm coaching coaches that are more on the spiritual side, usually the way I talk to them about it is like around transformation, because that's broad enough to where people are like, yeah, I want to transform. I don't know what I'm going to transform into, or I don't know what, like, I want things to be different. I want me to feel different and the
Mm-hmm.
world to be different. So they're looking for like a transformation. It's kind of the broadest level.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to your story, so you came back to the US, and then so you went into coaching, and then what made you go into like executive business coaching?
So a lot of that just comes down to, like, can you speak the language? So I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs, and like, it's quite easy.
Okay.
There's no difference, in my opinion, between executive coaching and like spiritual transformation coaching from a
Mm-hmm.
coaching perspective. It just is like where you're pointing your lens. And with executive coaching in particular, like right now I have a couple of fairly high level clients within a couple of tech companies, right? That would be like household names. They're not like Google, but a Google type place.
Mm-hmm.
And the main difference, it's the same kind of work that I do with my entrepreneur clients, or even like a personal transformation client. It's just that you have to be able to really quickly speak the language that they're speaking. And so a lot of times if people are thinking about like breaking into executive coaching, you have to know how to talk to executives, right? That's the main thing. Or you can slow them down and ask questions like, what the heck is that? Like, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is net revenue? What are you talking about? Like, what are the acronyms that they use? But the same thing goes for spiritual coaching too, right? When I'm coaching people on the transformative side, they're going to say things like shadow work, or my attachment
Mm-hmm.
style, or they may say
Mm-hmm.
sadhana, or they may say dharma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or then whatever, naroda. They're throw around these terms, and you have to be conversant in it, is the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another
Okay.
piece of
So
it too is, yeah, go ahead.
no, tell
No,
me.
please. I forgot.
I was just saying, so no, I was just summarizing. You were saying, so knowing their language, speak their language.
Yeah, you have to speak their language because you can't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Like that. And also, like, who do you want to work with? That's the thing for coaches. Like, who do you really want to work with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the question. But so, what made you want to work with
It
executive?
just,
What happened?
that's it. It really, I fell into it, is all it is. I fell
Okay.
into it. So, like, my first few clients were executive type people, entrepreneurs and executives. And so one thing leads
Mm-hmm.
to another, and then you start to build, right? And before you know it, you're kind of doing that thing. It wasn't
Okay.
necessarily so intentional.
Okay. And so
Also,
then,
well, I will say this.
yeah.
I'm a little bit, even though I have the background with Buddhism, I love talking about it and writing about it and sharing and all of that. I really don't love myself as any kind of like teacher of those things, right? I like to there are plenty of really, really great teachers out there. So maybe some of it is orienting away from that side of things. So that way I don't want to be, people get really weird about teacher type or coach type people that have that persona. And what I've seen is sometimes that can lead to a lot of really rigid, clinging, egotistic. And so that I don't like for myself.
But they have that persona of like spiritual teacher or just teacher?
Yeah, something like that. Maybe like spiritual teacher or something, like, I don't know. That makes me nervous for myself.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So what is about teaching more of that side?
Well, I can teach it for sure. It's just the idea that if you're going to follow some kind of path, like, follow the path, right? Don't do it haphazard. If you want to be Buddhist, start practicing Buddhism. Doesn't mean you have to take vows or anything like that. If you want to study the yogic path, study the yogic path. If you want to do transformational things with shamans, down in South America, then go do that. Don't do like halfway,
Mm-hmm. You mean don't do a little bit of that and then become a coach and then
Yeah, exactly.
so it's like
Exactly.
just be one thing.
Right. Try to, focus on one thing. Yeah. That's one way to think about it for sure.
Okay. I hear you. I hear you.
I will say
Yeah.
too, I mean, we haven't talked about psychedelics at all. I had a
Mhm.
chance when I was studying so early on, I had a couple of really good experiences with psychedelics, particularly psilocybin. And I had the same insight, no, perspective that I think I have now, which is like it's very healing psychologically, given the right kind of circumstances. And then I had the chance
Mhm.
to study in my graduate work with Stanislav Grof, and then also Ralph Metzner, who was with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass at Harvard. And so at the time, those were like big names. Now, maybe not so much. Stan Grof did early work with MDMA
Mhm.
therapy before it was illegal. And so meeting them in person, I was like, yeah, this is a very beneficial. Well, like Stanislav Grof, he has a book called Psychology of the Future, back from like 1995 or something. And I still believe
Mhm.
that it is the psychology of the future. Should taken
Mm.
35 years or whatever to get there, because it can be incredibly psychologically healing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, there's a lot to it's a big field opening now to really explore, discover, and make good use of it. And they often talk about this time being like this second renaissance or the renaissance
Hmm.
of psychedelic therapy,
Hmm.
being the first exploration being the 60s, when some people point at that as being a sort of more immature approach, in the sense that the enthusiasm being there was misuse at the end,
Yeah.
um, which delayed the second time period. Or maybe, as we said, it had to be that way, probably.
Yeah. I mean, whether
It
it
was
had to or
meant to
not, but
be.
it does feel like there is a new renaissance, and there's more care taken to the intention, which is early on. They talked
Yes.
about like the set and the setting, right? So your mindset, meaning, is the set,
Hmm.
and the setting is like where you're doing something. So it's like the intention, and then the kind of outer world is arranged to that. But if you think about
Yeah.
literally like anything, if you want to get the most out of it, you have to think about your intentions going into it, and then the setting is
Hmm.
conducive to those experiences, right? If you So think
Hmm.
about like a night out with somebody, what are your
Hmm.
intentions, and then how can you create that experience? It can be very meaningful,
Hmm.
or it can be very
Hmm.
damaging. So it's not the substance itself that holds the healing. It's the catalyst of it, but it also is your mindset, and then the setting in which you do it. So hard to
Hmm.
have a transformative experience or a psychologically healing experience if you're just taking, some, a gram of psilocybin at a party. Somebody gives you grams of psilocybin at a party. Totally fine, do that, but that's very different than like I'm going to take 3 grams. I'm going to do healing work before. I'm going to have this experience in beautiful nature and then process it out on the other way, right?
Hmm. Hmm. No, definitely. As you said, intention. And I think that here, as we're both coach and also, and all the other background, we understand how important it is to approach. It would be better every moment, but honestly, I have to say, I don't do it every moment. Don't approach every moment of my life with such intention.
Yeah,
But
same.
definitely would be the best way. But at least the most important moment to approach with intention. And in most important moments can also be like a discussion with your partner or with your kids, or like a dinner with friends. Approaching with intention, reflecting, even if for a couple of moments, of how you want to be, what you want to bring to that situation.
That's exactly right. And that goes back to, in Buddhist practice, particularly in Tibetan Buddhist practice, in the very beginning of meditation, when you sit down to meditate, the very first thing that you do, you take refuge, meaning like you place your trust in the enlightened nature of both yourself and others, right? And then the next piece is you create
Mm.
compassion, and you think that you're doing that that you may not be enlightened right now, but you're on the path and you're doing this for the benefit of everyone. They talk about all sentient beings, right? Meaning everybody in the entire universe. So that's the intention. And that's a very different intention than I'm going to sit down with my meditation timer and watch my breathing for 5 minutes because I'm stressed, right? One is like, I'm going to do something big for the world and I'm trying my best. The other is just like, oh, I'm going to lessen my own stress. That's fine. Nothing wrong with it, even if you're doing the same kind of tool. But one is very, very transformative. The other is not so much.
Yeah, it's intention and mindset. It reminds me, I forgot where I saw this little analogy, a story of like, there's like 3 people cutting stone. So the first, like he's asked, what are you doing? I'm just cutting stones. And the other, oh, well, I'm cutting stone to provide for my family so my family can have food. And the third one say, I'm building a cathedral.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yep. That's right. And so like the karmic merit, meaning like the positive spiritual energy of the person building the cathedral is much, much higher than the person that's just cutting stones, right? The next person doing it for his family is next, and then that person. Yeah, so it's possible to, with the right intention, you can transform anything.
And first, you're transforming yourself. Because imagine doing the same kind, like cutting stone, but doing it with this, knowing that you're building a cathedral.
The moment you transform your intention, you transform the situation and yourself at the exact same time. So the moment you experience that feeling, it's co-creating at the same time. In Tibetan, in Sanskrit, they talk about it as co-emergent, right? So like you can't, I'll give you another example. If you see somebody, if you identify somebody as like just a regular old person, that's fine. But if you identify somebody as like, oh, that's an enlightened person, that's a very enlightened person, and then you go to get a blessing from that person, even if the person is not enlightened, you still get the blessing because you transform your mind at the same time by projecting it out, because all of our experiences are only projections of our own mind.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So how can one use this for his or benefit, or like so everyone's benefit on a daily practice? How can you practice this?
I would say I would say it's maybe, I don't know if it's hard or easy these days. I'm so like kind of steeped in tradition. Find a tradition or a practice, and it doesn't have to be a traditional practice, right? It just has to be something like a thing, a path, and do that path. It's not enough. In the West, we oftentimes have this idea of like, oh, I read these books and I understand these concepts, because that comes from like, in a lot of Christianity, it's like, what's the highest practice? It's just like reading the Bible and then praying and like having some sense of Jesus, but it's not like really eminent. But find a path that will really get you there. And like a lot of, I had a chance to hang out with some Eastern Orthodox people, priests, and they have a path. Like they have a path, they have practices, they have like ways to progress along the path. So what I'd recommend is, instead of trying to find like one practice, much better to find one path and then use those practices. Otherwise, it's like, yeah, okay, I can teach you the highest practice possible, but I don't know how much transformation it will create.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Is, as you said, like in the West, we have this idea of, or like we approach everything with intellect only. So with the intellect knowledge. And so we think that, okay, as I read the book, I know it. Yes, but you don't know it deeply in with your experience. And that's where you say that about the path.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, before moving, like just the last question about Harmoniously and your role in Harmoniously, I wanted to mention, and that maybe we can talk about it later also, like about the Catholic Church. There's at least one path that is definitely you can see as a path, and it's the San Francis Order for the priest are kind of path. And I always talk about that because I grew up in that church, and I've always seen the light in the eyes of the Franciscan, I don't know the name in English exactly.
Yeah, the
priest.
monks. Yeah,
The monks.
The Franciscan order priests. Yeah, and the monks.
Yeah. They just have that light of, in their eyes of enlightened beings, and always been amazing. And I recently met one it's winter here in Italy, and he was still walking around with sandals because that's part of their practice.
Yeah.
And it was just like, please out anyway.
Yeah. I don't mean to, in the West, there's so many paths. There are a lot of those paths, right? Like Christianity itself has so many paths, even in Catholicism, multiple like ways to do it. And then the Eastern Orthodox. And then I would say, I have a good friend who's Mormon as well. And he also has a path. It's just, and maybe I'm being too critical in that way, because same thing in the East, like the average, quote unquote Buddhist practitioner is just lighting some incense. They aren't necessarily following a serious path. But if you are wanting to follow a serious path, find the path. Don't look for some pretty thing along the path and then try to work that into your life. Like, follow the path. If you want to be Franciscan, be as Franciscan as you can. If you want to be Eastern Orthodox, if you're trying to be Mormon, if you want to be Buddhist, Zen, or whatever, find the path. It doesn't mean you can't adjust the path or find something later, but you will never regret walking seriously on a path.
I totally agree. It was just to mention San Francisco Order because they're amazing.
Yeah, exactly. They really are.
I just love. Yes, it just. I think it's just so beautiful when you meet whoever will have a spiritual path they are. When you meet someone that is in a spiritual path and you see that light shine through their eyes, it's just amazing. Whatever the path is, when you see that, it's just beautiful encounter. Anyway, so just to probably conclude, so what about now you are in Harmoniously? So what's your role, and just tell us quickly about Harmoniously.
TBD, to be determined. No, I mean, my role, I see it as, I knew Sean for a while, and I see my role as more of like strategic guidance overall as we continue to get up and going, and then just kind of exploring some of the modalities, like what's the intersection between coaching and the psychedelic modalities, particularly ketamine, but others as well. And as things become legalized, like how might more people experience healing within a framework that's most beneficial to them, whether it's coaching or therapy or whatever. So that's how I see it.
Exactly. And soon we'll explore how about ketamine coaching and executive.
It would be interesting.
Business.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be interesting
to see how all this piece will come together and create something incredible, probably.
Yeah. I will say all of my clients are interested in that side of things. And now that might be confirmation bias because they're attracted to me and I'm interested in that. But I think the tide is really turning. It's becoming much more common in our culture, even from 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, right? Like I would never go on a podcast and say like, oh yeah, I've been doing psilocybin regularly, for 20 years or whatever. It's not something that was talked about, but now it's quite commonplace.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Any last words?
No, this has been great. I appreciate you taking the time.
Perfect. So thank you, Nick, for coming to our podcast, to Harmoniously podcast. And thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any question, just reach out to us. And otherwise, thank you so much and talk soon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.